Somewhere in the United States Army's classified archives, there is a film reel. It was shot in 1963. The footage shows a group of young men, soldiers, all of them volunteers, all of them told they were participating in a routine medical study. They are standing in a field. They are in full military uniform. They have been given something. And what happens next, in that footage, is not something the Army wanted the public to see. Some of the men are laughing at things that are not there. Some are talking to people who do not exist. One man is attempting to climb a tree that, by every account of the witnesses present, he genuinely believed was a staircase. Another is sitting very still in the grass, staring at his hands, and quietly, methodically, trying to count his fingers. He cannot get past 4. He tries again, and again, and again. The experiment was called Project Shipboard Hazard and Defense. The drug was called BZ, and for reasons that will become clear by the end of this story, almost nobody knows this happened. Not because it was hidden particularly well, but because when you hide something in plain sight, when you bury it in the language of declassified bureaucracy, in the footnotes of congressional hearings that nobody reads, in the archives of an institution that controls its own narrative, you do not need to hide it at all. The truth was always there, waiting for someone to look. Today, we are going to look, and what we find is not comfortable. It is not resolved. It does not have the clean ending that justice is supposed to provide. What it has instead is something more honest and, in some ways, more disturbing. The portrait of a system that used its own people, denied it, and then constructed a silence so complete that most of the men who lived through it went to their graves without a single official acknowledgement of what had been done to them. This is that story. Edgewood Arsenal sits on 13,000 acres in the northeast corner of Maryland, roughly 25 miles from Baltimore. If you drive past it today, it looks like any other military installation. Fencing, guard posts, flat industrial buildings set back from the road. Unremarkable. Forgettable. The kind of place your eye skips over without registering. Between 1955 and 1975, approximately 7,000 United States Army soldiers passed through those gates as test subjects in one of the most extensive and least discussed human experimentation programs in American military history. They were not prisoners. They were not enemies. They were American soldiers who had enlisted to serve their country. Some were told, in vague and carefully worded language, that they would be participating in studies related to chemical defense. They were told the studies were important for national security. They were told their participation would help protect their fellow soldiers on future battlefields. Some of them were not told very much at all. The program tested dozens of substances: nerve agents, psychochemicals, hallucinogens, incapacitants. Compounds whose names appear in the declassified records with the clinical detachment of grocery lists. The scientists at Edgewood were not, in the clinical sense of the word, monsters. They were researchers, many of them genuinely brilliant, operating within a Cold War framework that understood human beings as legitimate variables in equations about military advantage. What they were doing, what they told themselves they were doing, was science. But one drug stood above the rest. One compound became the centerpiece of a program that lasted years, consumed millions in funding, and left a trail of consequences that extended decades beyond the final test. That drug was BZ. Its full chemical name is 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate. In classified documents from the 1960s, it was referred to as Agent BZ, or simply the incapacitant. The CIA had its own name for it. They called it the nightmare drug. The name was not metaphorical. BZ is an anticholinergic compound, a substance that blocks the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is responsible for a remarkable range of bodily functions: saliva, sweat, digestion. and, most critically for the Army's purposes, the filtering mechanism by which the human brain distinguishes between what is real and what is not. When you remove that mechanism, the brain does not go quiet. It does not slow down. It does not become peaceful or empty or still. It goes the other direction entirely. It fills the silence with content. It manufactures a reality, complete and detailed and internally consistent, from nothing. And the person experiencing it has no way of knowing, no neurological mechanism remaining to tell them that what they are seeing, hearing, and feeling is not there. The first experiments with BZ at Edgewood began in the late 1950s. The early doses were small. The researchers were cautious. They were watching for something specific, a dose that would render a soldier non-functional without killing him, incapacitation without lethality, the perfect weapon in the theoretical framework of Cold War chemical strategy. They found what they were looking for, and then they began to scale. Private First Class James Schofield was 22 years old when he arrived at Edgewood Arsenal in the spring of 1964. He had enlisted 2 years earlier, straight out of high school in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner who had spent 30 years underground and did not want that for his son. James was quiet, careful, methodical, the kind of young man who read the terms of agreements before signing them, who asked questions before committing to things. He asked questions at Edgewood. He was told that the study involved testing protective clothing and equipment against potential chemical threats. He was told the substances he might be exposed to were carefully controlled. He was told that medical personnel would be present at all times and that any adverse effects would be treated immediately. He signed the consent form. It was 2 pages long. It used language that a lawyer would have needed another lawyer to interpret. He was not told what BZ was. He was not told what it did. He was not told that the men who had gone through the program before him had, in documented cases, experienced symptoms that lasted not hours, but days, that some had required physical restraint, that at least one man had been found walking in circles in the testing facility, whispering to someone named Gerald, for 11 hours straight, and that when he finally came back to himself he had no memory of any of it. None of this was in the 2-page form. On a Tuesday morning in April 1964, James Schofield was administered a dose of BZ. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. He sat in a chair in a white room. A researcher sat across from him with a clipboard. Someone checked his pulse every 10 minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed. He waited. Then, very slowly, the room changed. He said in a recorded interview conducted decades later as part of a VA research project that the first thing he noticed was the walls. They began to breathe. Not dramatically, not in the way that science fiction depicts hallucination, not pulsing and vivid and obvious, subtle, the way a curtain moves in a draft that you are not sure is there. Then the researcher sitting across from him became someone else. Not a stranger, someone he knew, a friend from basic training named Danny who had been sent to a different posting 18 months earlier. James knew, in some part of himself, that this could not be Danny. Danny was in Germany. But the part of himself that knew this became very small, very quickly, and the part that saw Danny became very large. He spent the next 6 hours in a reality that had nothing to do with Edgewood Arsenal. He was at home. He was at a baseball game. He was in a field he recognized from childhood, doing something important that he could not now remember. The researchers watching him through observation glass noted that he appeared calm, engaged. Occasionally he spoke to people who were not there. Occasionally he laughed. At hour 7, something shifted. The home and the baseball game and the childhood field dissolved. What replaced them was not calm. James later said he could not describe it with precision because the precision had been taken from him along with everything else. But the word he returned to, across multiple interviews, across 30 years of trying to find language for it, was wrong. Everything was wrong. Not frightening, exactly. Not painful. Just deeply, fundamentally, irreversibly wrong. Like a world where the rules had been changed without announcement and nobody would tell him what the new rules were, and he could not find the door. The researchers observed a change in his physical state. Increased agitation. Repetitive movements. They noted it in their logs. They did not intervene. He came back to himself at hour 11. He was sitting on a cot in a room he did not recognize. There was a man in a white coat sitting in a chair nearby, writing something on a clipboard. James tried to speak. His mouth was completely dry. BZ suppresses saliva production entirely. And the words came out wrong, shaped incorrectly as though his tongue had forgotten its job. The man in the white coat looked up. He said, "How are you feeling?" James said, or tried to say, "What happened to me?" The man in the white coat wrote something on the clipboard. He said, "You did great. Get some rest." And that was the debrief. James Schofield was not the only one. Across the same years, across the same program, thousands of other men sat in thousands of other white rooms and were handed the same 2-page form and asked to trust that what they were agreeing to was something they could afford to agree to. Most of them never spoke publicly about what happened to them. The culture of military service does not encourage disclosure. The culture of that particular era, the early 1960s, when the Cold War was not an abstraction but a daily, physical, present fear, encouraged something closer to its opposite. You did what you were told. You did not question the institution. You trusted that the men in the white coats knew things you did not know, and that the things they knew justified the things they were doing. But some of them talked. Sergeant Thomas Weatherly was 26 when he went through the program in 1967. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam before Edgewood. He had seen things in the field that he had spent years learning not to see when he closed his eyes. He was, by his own description, not easily frightened. What BZ did to him was different from anything the field had done to him. He described it, in a deposition given in connection with the 1987 class action proceedings, as losing the ground. Not losing consciousness. Not losing awareness. Losing the ground beneath his awareness. The thing that connects you to what is real. The thing you never know is there until it is gone. He said, "I have been in firefights. I have been in situations where I thought I was going to die, and I was not afraid in the way I was afraid inside that drug. Because in a firefight you know what is real. You know the ground under your feet is real. You know the direction of the threat is real. Inside that drug I did not know anything was real, including myself. Including myself." He paused when he said that. The court reporter noted the pause. It lasted 11 seconds. He continued, "And when it ended, when I came back, there was a period. It lasted maybe 2 weeks, where I was not sure. Where I would touch a wall and think, is this wall real? Where I would look at my wife and think, is she real? Where I would look at my own hands and think, are these my hands?" He received no follow-up care for this period. No one at Edgewood was monitoring him 2 weeks later. He was back at his posting. The experiment was complete. Private Raymond Collins was 19 years old, the youngest documented participant whose testimony has entered the public record. He came from Alabama. He had never been further from home than the state line before he enlisted. He was, by the account of the researchers who processed him into the program, in excellent physical health. No prior medical history of note, no psychiatric history. A model subject, in the language of the documentation. He was given BZ on a Wednesday morning in September 1963. What happened to him in the following 18 hours is documented in the researcher's log with the precision of a science experiment, because that is what it was. Body temperature, heart rate, pupil dilation, Behavioral observations noted at 15-minute intervals. At hour 3, the log notes, subject appears agitated, vocalizing, unable to confirm content of vocalizations. At hour 7, subject non-responsive to verbal direction, physical restraint applied as precaution. At hour 12, subject restrained, vocalizations continuing. Subject appears to be in distress. At hour 16, subject calm, appears to be sleeping. At hour 18, subject awake, oriented to person but not to place or time. Debrief initiated. The debrief, as recorded, consisted of 4 questions. Do you know your name? Do you know what day it is? Do you know where you are? How are you feeling? Raymond Collins answered the first question correctly. He could not answer the others. He was discharged from the program 2 days later with a notation in his file that read, "Participation complete. No adverse effects of note." He was 19 years old. He had been physically restrained for 6 hours while experiencing something the researchers described in their internal communications as a full psychotomimetic episode, and the official record said, "No adverse effects of note." Raymond Collins died in 1998. He had spent the intervening decades dealing with what his family described as episodes, periods where he was not himself, where something in him went somewhere else and did not come back right away, where he needed to be watched and waited for. His family did not know about Edgewood until 2004, when a researcher working on a VA study contacted them. His daughter said, in the interview that followed, he always said something happened to him in the Army, something he was not allowed to talk about. We thought he meant Vietnam. He never went to Vietnam. We did not know there was something else. She paused. She said, "He spent 40 years carrying something he was never allowed to name, and we spent 40 years not knowing what we were watching him carry. Now here is something that almost no account of the Edgewood experiments includes, something that expands the picture beyond the borders of the United States and into a country whose government has, if anything, been even more reluctant to acknowledge what it authorized. The United Kingdom ran its own program. At Porton Down, a military research facility in Wiltshire that has operated since 1916, and that the British government has spent a century trying not to draw attention to, researchers conducted parallel experiments with BZ and related compounds throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. The subjects were British servicemen. The consent procedures were, if anything, even more opaque than those at Edgewood. Men were told they were participating in studies related to the common cold, studies related to chemical protection, studies that would help develop defensive capabilities. They were not told they were being given psychochemical incapacitants. Some of them were not told anything specific at all. The British government acknowledged the existence of the Porton Down experiments in 1999, following a decades-long campaign by veterans and their families. A police investigation, Operation Antler, was launched to determine whether criminal offenses had been committed against the men who had participated. The investigation ran for 6 years. It concluded in 2006 with no prosecutions. The Crown Prosecution Service determined that while the experiments had been unethical by modern standards, the evidence was insufficient to support criminal charges under the law as it had applied at the time. The families of the men who had died, and some had died, including a 20-year-old airman named Ronald Madison who died in 1953 after being exposed to sarin at Porton Down, received this conclusion with the particular exhaustion of people who had been fighting for acknowledgement for so long that the absence of it had become almost expected. A civil settlement was reached in 2008. The UK government agreed to pay compensation to veterans of the Porton Down experiments without admitting liability. Without admitting liability. The phrase does a great deal of work in the history of institutional accountability. It means, we will pay. We will not say why. We will not say what we knew. We will not say what we should have done differently. We will write the check and close the file and hope that closing the file is enough. For some families, the check was not nothing. Money, when you have spent decades fighting for recognition, is at least evidence that someone in power acknowledged something happened. For others, it landed differently. The daughter of one Porton Down veteran, a man who had participated in chemical experiments in 1962 and who had spent the following decades in and out of psychiatric care before dying in 1989, was asked by a journalist what the settlement meant to her. She said, "It means they knew. That's what it means. If they didn't know, they wouldn't pay. But they won't say what they knew. And my father is dead. And there's no amount of money that answers the questions I've been asking since I was 8 years old." The decision to weaponize BZ was not made in secret back rooms by shadowy figures who wrung their hands over the moral implications. The documentation that has since been declassified shows something more banal and in some ways more disturbing. It was made in meetings, with agendas, with presentations and reports and memos that circulated through institutional channels with the mundane efficiency of any bureaucratic process. The weapon was designated M43, a bomblet, roughly the size of a baseball, designed to be dropped in clusters from aircraft. On impact, it would release BZ as an aerosol. Anyone within the exposure radius would, within 30 to 60 minutes, become combat ineffective. They would not be dead. They would be somewhere else entirely. The M43 was approved for the U.S. military's chemical weapons stockpile in 1961. It remained there until 1989, when the United States began destroying its chemical weapons arsenals under international agreements. For 28 years, the United States military possessed and maintained a weapon specifically designed to chemically induce psychosis in enemy combatants. And the men who had helped develop it, the 7,000 soldiers who had participated in the experiments that made it possible, were living their lives with no official acknowledgement of what they had been part of. No follow-up medical program, no long-term health monitoring. In many cases, no documentation of what specific substances they had been exposed to, at what doses, or for how long. Some of them were fine. The body, resilient and adaptive, can absorb a great deal. Some of them were not fine, and the system that had used them had no particular infrastructure for caring about the difference. The Veterans Administration, when survivors of Edgewood began to come forward in the 1980s, was not prepared for them. The system had been designed to process gunshot wounds and shrapnel and the physical damage of conventional combat. It had not been designed for men who came in saying, "I participated in an experiment in 1964, and I have been having episodes ever since, and I do not know what was done to me, and I cannot get anyone to tell me." There were no records. Or there were records, but they were classified. Or they had been destroyed. Or they existed, but could not be linked to specific individuals because of the way the program had been documented. The veterans who sought answers were, in many cases, told that their records could not be found. Some were told their records had never existed. One veteran, whose name appears in subsequent litigation documents, was told by a VA administrator that he might be misremembering his service history, that perhaps he had not been at Edgewood at all. He had letters, he had photographs, he had the scars from blood draws that had never properly healed. The administrator reviewed these and said she would look into it. He never heard back. The first public crack in the wall came not from a whistleblower or an investigator or a journalist. It came from a piece of legislation. In 1975, Senator Edward Kennedy chaired a series of hearings on human experimentation in the United States, part of the broader Church Committee investigations into CIA and military intelligence abuses that defined that era. The Edgewood program came up, not as the centerpiece, as a footnote, as one item in a long list of things that had been done to American citizens and American soldiers in the name of national security. The testimony was brief. The language was careful. The men who had run the program did not volunteer information that was not directly asked for. They had been doing this for a long time. They knew exactly how much silence to leave around an answer. But the crack was there. In 1977, a researcher at the National Archives came across a filing cabinet that had been mislabeled. Inside it were documents related to a CIA program called MK Ultra, a separate but parallel human experimentation initiative that overlapped with the Edgewood work in ways that would take investigators years to fully map. CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of all MK Ultra files in 1973. Most were gone. These weren't. What emerged from those files over the following months and years was a picture of interconnected programs, military, intelligence, academic, that he had been testing psychochemical compounds on human subjects, often without their full knowledge or consent, since the early 1950s. The programs had different names, different funding streams, different institutional homes, but they shared a philosophy, a conviction that the Cold War justified the sacrifice of individual rights on the altar of national security, that some people, selected by circumstances and rank and the absence of political power to object, could be used. The most comprehensive legal reckoning came, improbably, in 2009, more than 3 decades after the Kennedy hearings. More than 4 decades after James Schofield had sat on a cot and asked what happened to me and been told you did great, get some rest. A class action lawsuit brought by Vietnam Veterans of America against the CIA and the Department of the Army alleged that the government had conducted illegal experiments on soldiers, failed to provide adequate informed consent, and then systematically denied veterans access to information about what had been done to them. Information that was directly relevant to their health, to the treatment of conditions they had been living with for decades, to the understanding of why they were the way they were and whether the way they were was something that had been done to them. The case moved through the courts with the geological slowness that characterizes litigation against the federal government. In 2009, a federal judge ruled that the CIA and the Army had a legal obligation to notify veterans who had participated in the Edgewood experiments of any health risks associated with the substances they had been exposed to. This sounds like a victory. In a narrow sense, it was. In a practical sense, the ruling collided immediately with the reality of what the government actually knew, or was willing to say it knew, about the long-term effects of BZ and the other compounds tested at Edgewood. The studies that would have established those effects had not been conducted. The follow-up medical program that should have tracked the health of the 7,000 participants had not been implemented. The records that would have told individual veterans exactly what they had been exposed to were, in many cases, incomplete, classified, destroyed, or simply unavailable. The government's obligation to inform veterans of health risks ran directly into the government's inability, or unwillingness, to specify what those risks were. The circle closes neatly. The absence of evidence becomes its own protection. James Schofield was 67 years old when the 2009 ruling came down. He had spent his working life as a high school history teacher in Pennsylvania. He had married. He had 3 children. By his own account, he had managed. He had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a life. But there were years in the 1970s that he did not talk about in detail. There were patterns, he chose this word carefully in his interview, patterns of perception that had come and gone over the decades. Nothing that had prevented him from functioning. Nothing that a doctor, presented with his symptoms in isolation, would have necessarily connected to a morning in April 1964 at Edgewood Arsenal. He had never told the VA about those years. He had not known, until the litigation brought it into public view, that there might be a connection worth reporting. When the notification finally came, a letter, formal and carefully worded, informing him that he had participated in a program involving chemical compounds and that he might wish to consult a physician. He sat with it for a long time. He said he did not know whether to feel relieved or angry. He said, "I have been a history teacher for 30 years. I have taught my students about systems, about how institutions protect themselves, about how the people inside them make decisions that seem rational in the moment and monstrous in retrospect. I taught this. I believed it about other times and other places." He paused. He said, "It is different when the institution is the one that gave you a form to sign when you were 22 years old." The question that never received a fully satisfying answer, the question that sits at the center of this story like a room that everyone can see but nobody will enter, is, what did BZ do to these men over time? The short-term effects are documented: the hallucinations, the disorientation, the physical symptoms, the suppression of bodily functions that normally operate without conscious direction. The long-term effects are a different matter. The research that exists is sparse, fragmentary, and largely derived from the observations made during the experiments themselves. Observations made by people with a vested interest in the program's continuation and no institutional incentive to document outcomes that would question its ethics. What the veterans reported, across decades of attempts to connect their experiences to their health, included cognitive changes, perceptual disturbances that came and went without apparent pattern. A particular quality of disconnection that some described as never quite feeling fully inside their own experience again. A sense of having been altered in some way that was real and significant, but invisible to the instruments available to measure it. None of this proved anything in the clinical sense. Proof requires methodology. Methodology requires data. Data requires the kind of longitudinal follow-up study that was never conducted because conducting it would have required acknowledging, formally and in detail, what had been done. The circle closes again, and again, and again. In 2018, the United States Army officially confirmed, in response to a Freedom of Information request, that BZ had been tested on soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal between 1959 and 1975. The confirmation was not new information. It had been established through decades of litigation and congressional testimony. But the official acknowledgement was new. The formal, on record, attributed to an institution statement that, yes, this happened, and yes, these were the parameters. The statement did not include an apology. No apology has been issued. The soldiers who participated in the Edgewood experiments, those who are still living, who would now be in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, have received in aggregate a legal ruling requiring notification, a formal confirmation that the program existed, and access, in some cases, to partial records. They have not received a determination of what those experiments did to their health over a lifetime. They have not received compensation structured around that determination. They have not received what James Schofield said he had spent 55 years waiting for. He was asked, in the final recorded interview he gave before his death in 2019, what he had wanted, what would have been enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I just wanted someone to sit across from me and say, 'We know what we gave you. We know what it did. We know you didn't fully agree to it. And we are sorry.' That is all I ever wanted. For someone to sit there and say it like they meant it. Nobody ever did." Here is what you need to understand about why this story matters beyond the specific injustice it represents. The architecture that made Edgewood possible, the classification system, the consent frameworks that were technically legal but practically meaningless, The institutional structure that permitted one part of the government to use citizens as test subjects, while another part denied those citizens access to their own records. That architecture was not dismantled. It was reformed. It was reviewed. New guidelines were written. The National Research Act of 1974, passed in direct response to abuses like those at Edgewood, established the framework for ethical human research that still governs American science today. The Belmont Report followed. Institutional review boards were created. The mechanisms of oversight were put in place. But mechanisms are only as strong as the institutions that implement them. And institutions, by their nature, protect themselves. They protect their funding. They protect their authority. They protect the people within them who make decisions that, viewed from the outside and from a distance of decades, require protection. The question is not whether a program exactly like Edgewood exists today. The question is what we assume when we are told that our government's relationship to its own citizens is governed by rules that were written specifically because the alternative was this. The question is what we trust, and why, and whether that trust has been earned or simply inherited from a silence so thorough that we mistook it for evidence. Raymond Collins' daughter was asked in the interview after she learned what had happened to her father whether she was angry. She thought about it. She said, "I was angry for a long time. I'm past anger now. What I am is clear. I am very clear about what happened. I am clear that my father was used. I am clear that the institution that used him then spent 40 years pretending it hadn't. I am clear that the settlement they offered was designed to make the problem go away without making it right." She paused. She said, "What I want people to understand is that my father was not naive. He was not foolish. He trusted, because trust is what you do when someone in authority hands you a form and tells you it is important. He did what they asked, and they did what they wanted, and then they called it science." James Schofield was 22 years old on a Tuesday morning in April 1964. He had read the form. He had asked his questions. He had believed the answers he was given. He spent the next 55 years trying to get the same consideration in return. The Army's records show that his participation in the Edgewood program was classified as a successful trial. His name appears on one document, in a list of participants. No other record of what happened to him that Tuesday, of what was put into his body, of what it did, of what the researchers noted in their logs, was ever provided to him. He asked, multiple times, across multiple decades, through letters, through legal proceedings, through the VA, through his congressman's office. The responses he received were courteous. They were apologetic in tone. They explained with great care the limitations of what could be shared and why. None of them answered his question. He died in June 2019 at the age of 77, in the same town in Pennsylvania where he had grown up. His obituary mentioned his military service. It mentioned his 30 years as a high school history teacher. It mentioned his wife, his 3 children, his grandchildren. It did not mention Edgewood. Nobody knew to write it down. And somewhere in the United States Army's classified archives, there is still a film reel. It was shot in 1963. The footage shows a group of young men, soldiers, volunteers, told they were participating in a routine medical study. One of them is trying to count his fingers. He cannot get past 4. The reel has never been released to the public. It probably never will be. I'll see you in the next one.